Mars has been called humanity's next home, but the reality is far harsher than the dream. Between deadly radiation, toxic dust, freezing temperatures, and the impossibility of emergency rescue, the first humans sent to Mars will face a mission where survival is uncertain from the moment they arrive. Today, we're breaking down the real risks that make a one-way outcome not just possible, but likely under current technology, what Mars actually is. The moment the spacecraft drops out of cruise and the red planet starts filling the window, it does not look like a destination that is waiting for visitors. It looks like a place that has been sitting untouched for billions of years and never changed its mind about being empty. And that is the first thing the crew inside would feel, even before anything technical is said. Because Mars does not present itself as a place of opportunity. It presents itself as a place where everything is already decided, long before humans arrive. The landing sequence begins far above the surface, where the spacecraft hits the thin upper edge of the atmosphere at extreme speed, and even though this atmosphere is called air, it is so thin that it behaves more like a soft ghost of gas than anything that can actually slow a vehicle properly. And this is the first problem that engineers have to fight with perfect timing, because there is no room for error when a vehicle is entering at several kilometers per second, and every stage of descent has to work exactly as designed, or the mission ends right there. As the heat shield takes the first impact of atmospheric friction, the outside temperature of the vehicle rises to levels hot enough to melt metal if it goes wrong for even a moment, and plasma forms around the capsule, cutting off radio communication completely. So for several minutes, the crew is physically arriving on Mars, but completely cut off from Earth, and nobody on either side can change what is happening, which is why engineers call this part of the landing sequence the most dangerous part of any Mars mission, because it is fully automatic and fully irreversible once it begins. Then the parachutes deploy, but even this moment is not simple, because Mars' atmosphere is so thin that parachutes that would work on Earth do not behave the same way here. They do not open with the same force, they do not slow the craft as quickly, and they only take off a small fraction of the speed, which means the spacecraft is still moving far too fast when it reaches lower altitudes, and that is why rockets must fire in the final phase, because only engine thrust can complete the landing, not air resistance. And while all of this is happening, the surface of Mars is already waiting, and the surface is not gentle. It is frozen, dry, and covered in fine dust that has been sitting undisturbed for millions of years. And when the landing legs finally touch down, the first contact is not a landing in the normal sense. It is more like a controlled crash that just barely stayed inside safe limits. And even then, there is no celebration in the traditional sense, because the real environment is just beginning to show itself. The average temperature on Mars sits around -63 degrees Celsius. But this is only an average, not a stable condition. And in many regions, the temperature can drop far lower at night or during seasonal changes. And in these conditions, any exposed metal becomes brittle, any exposed liquid freezes quickly, and any failure in heating systems immediately becomes a survival problem, rather than a comfort issue. The atmospheric pressure is around 0.6 kilopascals, which is less than 1% of Earth's pressure, and this single number changes everything about survival, because it means that liquid water cannot stay stable on the surface for long. It either freezes or turns into vapor, and it also means that a human body without a suit would not just struggle, it would fail almost immediately, because there is simply not enough pressure to keep internal fluids stable. The atmosphere itself is made up of about 95% carbon dioxide, which means there is almost no breathable oxygen at all, and there is no natural support system in the air, no protection layer, no balance for human life. Just a thin, cold gas layer that does nothing to help survival. And every breath outside a sealed system would be a countdown measured in seconds. At this point, the situation is already clear in engineering terms, because Mars is not a place where humans can step out and adapt. It is a place where humans must bring every part of survival with them. And if any system stops working, there is nothing natural on the planet that can replace it. And this is only the surface condition. because what lies underneath is even more difficult to deal with. Mars is often described as a failed Earth, but this is not a poetic comparison. It is a geological reality, because billions of years ago Mars likely had a thicker atmosphere, flowing water, and a magnetic field. But over time it lost its global magnetic shield, and without that shield, solar wind from the Sun slowly stripped away most of its atmosphere, particle by particle, over millions of years, until the planet became what it is today, a world that still has traces of its past, but none of the protection needed to support it. On Earth, the magnetic field acts like an invisible barrier that deflects charged particles coming from space. But Mars does not have a strong global field anymore, only small local magnetic regions. And this means that solar radiation reaches the surface almost directly. And this is one of the reasons why Mars is so hostile to unprotected life. Because radiation is not blocked in the way it is on Earth. It is constantly present at the surface level. The radiation exposure on Mars is measured at levels significantly higher than on Earth. And over time, this becomes one of the most serious risks for human missions. Not because it causes immediate effects in every case, but because it builds damage slowly in the body, affecting cells and DNA in ways that increase long-term health risks. And unlike on Earth, there is no natural atmospheric layer thick enough to reduce this exposure significantly. Then there is the dust, which at first might not seem like a major problem compared to temperature or radiation. But it becomes one of the most persistent and difficult challenges once humans actually begin working on the surface. Because Mars dust is extremely fine, almost like powder, but chemically active in ways that are dangerous for human systems. The dust contains compounds called perchlorates, which are toxic to humans in certain concentrations. And these compounds can interfere with thyroid function and other biological systems if they enter the body. And because the dust is so fine, it can attach to equipment, seals, suits, filters, and even habitat entrances, meaning it can slowly enter systems that are supposed to remain completely sealed from the outside environment. Every time astronauts step outside their habitat, they bring a small amount of this dust back in, no matter how careful they are. And over time, this creates a contamination problem inside the habitat itself, where the environment is supposed to be fully controlled, but slowly becomes affected by particles that were never meant to enter it in the first place. Gravity on Mars is about 38% of Earth's gravity, which at first sounds like a benefit, because everything feels lighter, movement requires less effort, and lifting objects becomes easier. But this lower gravity also creates long-term biological challenges, because human muscles and bones are designed for Earth's gravitational load. And without that constant load, the body begins to weaken over time unless actively maintained through exercise and artificial resistance systems. This means that even though astronauts might feel physically comfortable at first, their bodies are actually adapting in the wrong direction for Earth-like health. And this becomes another silent pressure that builds over time during long missions. When all of these conditions are combined, the picture of Mars becomes very clear in practical terms, because it is not a planet that supports life in any natural way. It is a planet that requires life to be fully engineered from scratch and maintained without interruption, and any small failure in that engineering chain can quickly turn into a life-threatening situation. And even though early mission planning often focuses on landing success and initial surface operations, the real challenge begins after the landing, when systems must operate continuously in an environment that actively works against them at every level, from temperature to pressure, to radiation, to dust, to chemical exposure, all acting at the same time without pause. Mars does not need to actively destroy anything for problems to appear. It simply exists in a state where human life is not supported, and that absence of support is what makes every system critical, because nothing on the planet will step in if something fails. And this is only the beginning of understanding what it actually means to be there, because once humans leave the landing site and begin to build and operate in this environment, the real stress on survival systems starts to show in ways that cannot be fully predicted from Earth-based testing alone. Why we even want to send humans. Sending humans to Mars did not come from one single decision or one single breakthrough. It slowly formed from decades of pressure building across science, politics, and engineering. And from the moment we first sent machines into space and saw what other planets actually look like, Mars started to stand out as the next logical step. Not because it is easy or safe, but because it is the closest place that still looks like a real world, and not just a floating rock or a burning gas planet. And that simple fact has driven more serious planning than almost any other destination in the solar system. The path that leads from Earth missions today to human missions on Mars is often described through what NASA calls the Artemis to Mars pipeline, which is not a single mission, but a long chain of steps where each stage is designed to reduce risk before humans are sent farther away from Earth. And Artemis itself is not just about the moon. It is being used as a testing ground for systems that must work far from Earth, where help is not possible in real time. The logic behind this pipeline is simple in structure, but extremely complex in execution. Because before any human can be sent to Mars, engineers need to prove that they can live and work for long periods outside Earth's protective environment. And the moon becomes the closest place where this can be tested, even though it is still very different from Mars in atmosphere, gravity, and distance from the Sun. On the moon, missions can still receive near real-time communication from Earth, and emergency rescue is at least physically possible within days. But Mars removes both of those advantages, and this is why every step taken in the Artemis program is not just about exploration, but about stress testing systems that must one day survive completely alone, without immediate Earth backup. In this pipeline, habitats, power systems, life support systems, landing systems, and surface mobility tools are all being developed in smaller stages, tested first in Earth simulations, then in lunar missions, and eventually adapted for Mars conditions, because no single system failure can be allowed once humans are that far away. And every component must be designed with the assumption that repair support from Earth is slow, limited, or not possible at all during critical moments. At the same time, there is another major approach being developed outside of traditional space agencies, and that is the model pushed most strongly by SpaceX, which focuses on rapid deployment and building capability through repeated launches, instead of waiting for long intervals between highly controlled missions. And this approach is based on the idea that human presence on Mars will not come from one perfect mission, but from a growing system of flights that slowly build infrastructure over time. The SpaceX model is built around the idea that rockets like Starship can reduce the cost of transport enough to allow repeated cargo and human missions. And instead of sending a single, carefully optimized crew with maximum safety margins, the strategy depends on sending many missions that gradually build up fuel production systems, habitats, and supply chains directly on Mars, even if early missions carry higher risk levels. This creates a clear difference in thinking between the two major approaches, because NASA's model focuses on controlled safety steps and long validation cycles, while the SpaceX approach focuses on fast iteration and learning through real missions, even if early systems are not fully stable. And both approaches are trying to solve the same problem, which is how to keep humans alive in a place where no natural support exists at all. But beyond these engineering strategies, there are three major scientific reasons why humans are being considered for Mars at all, and each one comes from a different kind of pressure that machines alone cannot fully handle. The first scientific goal is planetary geology, which is the study of how Mars formed, how it changed over time, and why it lost the conditions that once made it more Earth-like, because Mars is one of the few planets where we can still see clear evidence of ancient riverbeds, dried lake basins, and layered rock structures that suggest liquid water once existed on the surface for long periods. And understanding how that water disappeared is not just about Mars itself, but about understanding how planets evolve in general. Robotic missions have already given a large amount of data about Martian soil, rock chemistry, and surface conditions. But robots have limits in how they can adapt in real time, and they follow pre-programmed instructions, which means they cannot make complex decisions in unexpected situations the way humans can, especially when geological features need to be explored in unpredictable ways, or when samples need to be selected based on subtle visual or environmental clues that may not be obvious to automated systems. This is why human geology missions are still considered valuable, because a trained geologist on Mars can move across terrain, select samples, change plans based on what they see in real time, and make decisions without waiting for delayed instructions from Earth, which is important when signal delays between Mars and Earth can reach up to 20 minutes one way depending on orbital position. The second scientific goal is biosignature detection, which means searching for evidence that life once existed on Mars, even if that life was only microbial. And this is one of the most important scientific questions in planetary science today, because if life started independently on two nearby planets in the same solar system, it would change how we understand the conditions required for life across the universe. Mars is considered one of the strongest candidates for past microbial life because it once had liquid water, a thicker atmosphere, and a more stable climate. And although current surface conditions are extremely harsh, ancient environments may have been far more suitable for life, especially in underground regions or lake systems that existed billions of years ago. While robotic missions are already equipped with instruments to detect chemical signs of past life, humans could expand the search in ways that machines cannot fully match, because human explorers can identify unusual rock formations, adjust sampling strategies quickly, and explore complex geological sites like deep canyons, cave systems, or layered sediment areas where signs of past biological activity might be preserved in subtle ways that require direct judgment to recognize. The third scientific goal is human survival limits, which is not just about surviving Mars, but about understanding exactly how far human biology can be pushed in extreme environments, because every system that keeps astronauts alive on Mars must operate at a level of precision that has never been tested for long periods in any other environment. This includes studying how the human body reacts to low gravity over long durations, how radiation exposure affects biological systems outside Earth's magnetic protection, and how closed life support systems behave when they must recycle air, water, and waste continuously without outside replacement for months or years at a time. These survival studies are not theoretical, because every Mars mission becomes a real-world experiment in how long humans can maintain health and cognitive function under extreme isolation, limited medical support, and constant environmental pressure. And the results from these missions will directly affect future designs for space habitats, deep space travel, and even Earth-based systems that rely on closed-loop environmental control. Beyond science, there are also political drivers behind Mars exploration, and these are often less visible in public discussions but extremely important in shaping how missions are funded and prioritized, because large space programs require long-term government support, and that support depends on national goals, global competition, and technological leadership. For many countries, space exploration is not just about discovery, it is also about maintaining technological capability and influence in advanced engineering fields, because countries that can build systems capable of reaching Mars demonstrate high levels of industrial strength, scientific education, and strategic capability. And this becomes part of global positioning in science and technology leadership. There is also an economic driver, which comes from the long-term possibility of using space technologies for new industries, including advanced materials, robotics, energy systems, and off-Earth resource utilization. Even though Mars itself is not expected to provide easy economic return in the short term, the technologies developed for it often feed back into Earth-based industries in unexpected ways, especially in areas like automation, remote systems, and high-efficiency life support design. Another important factor is competition, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one, because when multiple organizations and countries are working toward the same destination, Each success pushes others to accelerate their own plans, and this creates a cycle of rapid development where no one wants to fall behind in capability or technological progress. All of these drivers together form a layered motivation system that keeps Mars missions moving forward even when the risks are fully understood. Because the decision to send humans to Mars is not based on a single benefit or single discovery, but on a combination of scientific curiosity, engineering ambition, long-term strategic thinking, and the gradual build-up of systems that are slowly becoming capable of reaching a planet that does not offer any natural support in return. The transit problem, the first hidden killer. Before anyone even gets close to Mars, before they see the red dust or feel the weak gravity or step into a suit for the first surface walk, there is already a long period of danger that starts the moment the spacecraft leaves Earth orbit. And this part of the mission is often less talked about because it does not look dramatic from the outside. There is no explosion, no landing crash, no visible disaster, just a long, quiet travel through space that slowly changes the human body in ways that are hard to reverse once they begin. And this journey is not short, it is not fast, and it is not forgiving, because the distance between Earth and Mars means that even with the fastest realistic propulsion systems available today, the trip still takes about 6 to 9 months one way, depending on orbital position, fuel efficiency, and mission design. And during this entire time, the crew is living in a sealed environment where every system must function perfectly without interruption while the human body is exposed to conditions it was never designed for. The spacecraft itself is built to feel stable inside with controlled air pressure, filtered oxygen, temperature regulation, and carefully recycled water and food systems. But outside that thin protective shell, there is nothing except vacuum and radiation. And as the spacecraft moves farther from Earth, the safety net of quick support disappears completely, because even if something goes wrong, there is no way to send help quickly, no rescue mission that can arrive in days, and no emergency repair that can be done from the ground in real time. And this isolation becomes one of the first psychological pressures on the crew even before physical effects begin to show. Inside this environment, the human body starts to react almost immediately to microgravity, which is the condition where gravity is so weak that the body is no longer pressed against a surface in the normal way. And instead of standing or walking, astronauts float freely. And while this might look comfortable at first, it creates a major biological problem because the human body is built around constant resistance from gravity. And without that resistance, the muscles that support posture, movement, and basic strength begin to weaken because they are no longer being used in the same way. Muscle atrophy begins slowly but steadily, and over long periods it can reach levels of up to 30% loss in muscle mass if not actively controlled. And this is not just a loss of strength in a general sense, it affects specific muscle groups that are responsible for standing, lifting, and even basic balance, meaning that when astronauts eventually return to a gravity environment, their bodies are not immediately ready to function at normal levels, and they often need extensive physical recovery just to regain basic movement efficiency. Alongside muscle loss, bone density also begins to decrease, because bones are not static structures, they respond to load and pressure over time. And when that pressure is removed or greatly reduced, the body starts to break down bone material faster than it rebuilds it, leading to a gradual loss of strength in the skeletal system. And in space conditions, this can reach around 1 to 2% loss per month, depending on exercise routines, nutrition, and individual physiology, which means that over a long Mars transit, the skeletal system is continuously weakening, unless extremely strict countermeasures are followed every day. This is why exercise becomes a critical part of space travel, not as a fitness choice, but as a survival requirement, because astronauts must use resistance machines for several hours each day just to slow down the process of muscle and bone degradation. And even then, the protection is not perfect. It only reduces the rate of loss rather than completely stopping it, which means the body is still changing during the entire journey in ways that are not fully reversible in the short term. But while the physical effects of microgravity are serious, they are only one part of the transit problem, because outside the spacecraft there is another danger that is completely invisible and constant, and that is radiation, which becomes one of the most important hidden risks of deep space travel beyond Earth's magnetic field. On Earth, the magnetic field acts as a protective shield that deflects many charged particles coming from the Sun and deep space, and the atmosphere adds another layer of protection by absorbing or scattering radiation before it reaches the surface. But once a spacecraft leaves Earth orbit and moves into deep space, it leaves both of these protections behind, and the crew is exposed directly to radiation sources that are normally blocked or reduced on Earth. One of the main sources of this radiation is galactic cosmic rays, which are high-energy particles that originate from outside the solar system, often from distant supernova explosions or other energetic cosmic events. And these particles move through space at extremely high speeds, carrying enough energy to pass through most materials, including parts of spacecraft shielding, and when they interact with human tissue, they can damage cells at a microscopic level, including DNA structures, which increases long-term health risks such as cancer or neurological effects. Unlike some types of radiation that come in bursts or can be predicted in advance, galactic cosmic rays are constant, meaning that the spacecraft is always being exposed to them during the entire journey, and there is no way to turn them off or avoid them, only ways to reduce their intensity slightly through shielding, but not eliminate them completely. Another major radiation threat comes from solar particle events, which are bursts of energetic particles released by the Sun during solar storms or solar flares, and unlike cosmic rays, these events can happen suddenly and can increase radiation levels dramatically over a short period of time, creating spikes in exposure that can be dangerous if astronauts are not properly shielded or protected at the time of the event. During a strong solar particle event, radiation levels inside a spacecraft can rise quickly, and astronauts must move to shielded areas within the spacecraft, which are specially designed sections with thicker material protection, often surrounded by water tanks or fuel storage to help absorb radiation. But even with these precautions, there is still a limit to how much protection can be provided with current materials and spacecraft designs. The problem is that spacecraft shielding is one of the hardest engineering challenges in deep space travel, because adding more shielding usually means adding more mass, and more mass requires more fuel to launch and accelerate, which increases cost and reduces efficiency. So engineers are constantly balancing between protection and weight. And this balance means that current spacecraft cannot fully block all harmful radiation, only reduce it to lower levels. This creates a situation where astronauts are exposed to a controlled but still significant level of radiation throughout the entire transit period. And the longer the journey, the higher the total accumulated exposure becomes, which means that a 6 to 9 month trip to Mars is not just a travel time, it is also a continuous exposure period where every hour adds to the total biological impact on the body. Inside the spacecraft, radiation is not visible, not felt directly, and not immediately noticeable, which makes it even more dangerous in a way, because the human mind does not naturally respond to something it cannot sense, but the body is still being affected at a cellular level, and this creates a gap between perception and reality, where everything may feel normal during the journey, while biological damage is slowly accumulating in the background. Even the materials used in spacecraft walls, while advanced and carefully engineered, have limitations, because no currently practical material can fully block high-energy cosmic radiation without being too heavy to launch efficiently. And this is one of the major unsolved engineering problems in human space travel beyond low Earth orbit. Some designs use layered materials, water shielding or specialized polymers to reduce exposure. And some spacecraft concepts include storm shelters where astronauts can stay during solar events. But these solutions are still partial, meaning they reduce risk rather than eliminate it. And during a long journey, reduction is not the same as safety. It is only a lower level of danger that still continues over time. As the spacecraft travels farther from Earth and closer to Mars orbit, another layer of complexity appears. which is the psychological effect of isolation combined with physical stress, because the crew is not only dealing with environmental hazards, but also with the awareness that they are far beyond immediate rescue distance, and every system they rely on must continue working without external repair support. Communication delay also becomes more noticeable as distance increases, reaching several minutes one way, which means conversations with mission control are no longer real-time, and any decision that requires coordination must account for this delay, making the crew more independent in daily operations, but also increasing responsibility pressure because they must handle unexpected situations without immediate external input. Inside this environment, every small system becomes critical, from air recycling units to water recovery systems to temperature control, and even minor technical issues must be solved on board, because waiting for instructions or replacement parts is not an option. And this creates a constant background awareness that every system is both essential and fragile at the same time. Radiation, the invisible executioner. Mars looks quiet from far away, almost calm in a way that makes it easy to forget what kind of environment it really is. But the moment you remove Earth from the equation, one of the biggest hidden problems starts to show itself clearly, and that is radiation. Not the kind of radiation people usually think about in everyday life, but deep space and planetary radiation that comes from the Sun and from outside the solar system. And the important thing to understand first is that Mars has no global magnetic field to protect anything on its surface, which means there is no planet-wide shield wrapping around it the way Earth has. On Earth, the magnetic field acts like a giant invisible barrier that surrounds the entire planet and redirects charged particles away from the surface, and this works together with the thick atmosphere to reduce radiation levels before they ever reach human life on the ground. But Mars lost its global magnetic field long ago, and without that protection, radiation does not get deflected in the same way. It reaches much closer to the surface, and in many cases it reaches the surface directly, with only the thin atmosphere providing weak reduction, and that is not enough to bring it anywhere near Earth-like safety levels. This is why radiation levels on Mars are measured at around 50 to 1,000 times higher than what humans experience on Earth, depending on location, altitude, solar activity, and shielding conditions. And this range is not just a small increase, it is a major jump in exposure that completely changes how long humans can safely stay on the surface without accumulating serious biological risk. Because radiation is not something that only causes immediate damage, it is something that builds up slowly inside the body over time. When astronauts are exposed to radiation on Mars or during travel to Mars, the damage does not always appear immediately. And this is what makes it especially dangerous, because the human body can continue functioning normally while microscopic changes are happening at the cellular level. And these changes are not random surface effects, they go deeper into the structure of living tissue, especially at the level of DNA, which is the core instruction system inside every cell. One of the main types of damage caused by high-energy radiation is something called DNA double-strand breaks, which means that both strands of the DNA structure inside a cell are damaged at the same time. And when this happens, the cell has to try to repair itself. But the repair process is not always perfect, and over time, repeated damage and imperfect repair can lead to mutations, cell malfunction, or in some cases long-term health conditions, including increased cancer risk. And this is not an instant process. It builds slowly over months and years of exposure. On Mars, this becomes even more important because exposure is continuous, meaning astronauts are not just receiving radiation during a single event, they are exposed every day while living on the surface, and every hour adds to the total dose accumulated in their bodies. And this is what scientists mean when they talk about cumulative exposure, because the effect is not about one moment of radiation, but about the total sum of all radiation received over time. And when this total crosses certain biological thresholds, the risk of serious long-term damage increases significantly. The problem is that there is no natural reduction system on Mars strong enough to bring this exposure down to Earth-like levels, and even underground or partially shielded habitats only reduce it. They do not eliminate it completely, because high-energy particles can pass through many materials, especially the most energetic ones coming from deep space, which are called galactic cosmic rays. And these are some of the most difficult forms of radiation to block effectively with current technology. Another major source of radiation on Mars comes from solar activity, where the Sun releases bursts of energetic particles during solar storms. And these events are called solar particle events, and they can increase radiation levels suddenly over a short period of time, creating spikes in exposure that are much higher than normal background levels. And these spikes are especially dangerous because they can happen without much warning and can last from hours to days depending on the size of the event. During these solar events, astronauts would need to move quickly into shielded areas inside their habitat or spacecraft, which are designed as protected zones with thicker walls or additional shielding materials, often using stored water or fuel tanks as extra barriers against radiation. But even with these emergency shelters, protection is still limited by material weight and engineering constraints, meaning there is always a level of risk that cannot be completely removed. The idea of a radiation suit sometimes appears in public discussions about space travel, but in reality, suits are not designed to fully block radiation in the way people imagine, because a suit is mainly built for pressure, temperature control, oxygen supply, and protection from dust and physical hazards, not for blocking high-energy cosmic radiation. And even if suits had additional shielding layers, they would become too heavy and too rigid for astronauts to move in effectively during surface work. This creates a clear limitation, because there is no practical wearable system that can fully protect a human from Mars-level radiation while still allowing normal movement and work, which means protection must come from environment design rather than personal equipment. And that shifts the problem from individual safety gear to habitat engineering, mission timing, and exposure management strategies. Inside a Mars habitat, radiation shielding becomes one of the most important design requirements, and engineers often consider multiple layers of protection, including thick structural walls, buried habitats under regolith, or using natural terrain features like caves or lava tubes to reduce exposure. But even these solutions have limits because they depend on location, construction capability, and available resources, and none of them can fully recreate Earth's protective magnetic field or atmospheric shielding. The difference between acute and long-term radiation effects is also important to understand in this context, because acute effects happen when radiation exposure is extremely high in a short time, such as during a strong solar particle event without proper shielding, and this can cause immediate biological stress, nausea, fatigue, and in extreme cases more serious health impacts depending on dose levels. But these situations are less common if emergency protocols are followed correctly. Long-term effects are more subtle but far more important for Mars missions because they involve repeated exposure over months or years. And this leads to gradual biological changes inside the body, especially in sensitive systems like blood production, immune response, and neural tissue. And this is where central nervous system degradation becomes a concern, because high-energy particles can affect brain function over time by interacting with neural cells and supporting structures. Central nervous system damage does not mean immediate loss of function, but it can involve slower cognitive effects, changes in reaction time, memory performance, and processing ability under stress. And these changes are difficult to detect in early stages because the brain can compensate for a lot of small disruptions. But over long missions, especially in isolated and high-stress environments, even small changes in cognitive performance can become operational risks when astronauts need to make critical decisions. What makes this even more complex is that radiation effects are not uniform across all individuals, because different bodies respond differently based on genetics, health status, age, and previous exposure history, which means mission planners cannot assume identical effects across crew members. And this adds uncertainty when calculating safe exposure limits for long-duration Mars missions. Inside spacecraft travelling to Mars, radiation shielding is already a major design challenge because engineers must balance protection with weight constraints, and the more shielding added, the heavier the spacecraft becomes, which increases fuel requirements and launch costs. So there is always a trade-off between safety and practicality, and current materials can only reduce radiation to a certain level, rather than block it completely. Common shielding materials include metals like aluminum, and experimental approaches include hydrogen-rich materials, water layers, or specialized polymers. But none of these can fully stop the highest energy particles, which means that even inside a spacecraft, astronauts are still exposed to a reduced but continuous level of radiation throughout the entire journey. As the spacecraft moves from Earth orbit into deep space and then approaches Mars orbit, the protective influence of Earth's magnetic field becomes weaker until it disappears completely. And at that point, the crew is fully inside the interplanetary radiation environment, where both galactic cosmic rays and solar particles can reach the spacecraft without planetary shielding interference. Even during Mars surface missions, the radiation problem does not go away, because while the planet itself does not generate radiation, it also does not block it effectively. So astronauts must live in environments that constantly manage exposure levels, and this affects everything from habitat design to daily schedules, including how long astronauts can safely stay outside during surface operations. Every time a crew member steps outside for a surface activity, they are entering a higher exposure zone compared to inside the habitat, and even short exposure periods must be carefully planned to stay within safe limits. And this turns normal exploration tasks into timed operations where radiation dose is tracked and managed like a critical resource. Over long missions, this creates a constant background condition where radiation is not an occasional hazard, but a continuous factor in every decision, every activity, and every movement outside protected areas. And unlike mechanical risk that can be repaired or avoided, radiation cannot be stopped once exposure begins. It can only be reduced or managed within limits that are still not fully safe by Earth standards. Landing, the 7-minute death window. When a spacecraft finally reaches Mars after months of travel, it is not greeted by anything stable or forgiving. There is no controlled runway, no thick atmosphere to slow it down gradually, and no margin for error that can stretch across minutes or hours. Instead, there is a short and extremely intense phase called entry, descent, and landing. And this phase is often described in engineering terms as the most dangerous part of the entire mission, because everything that has been built, tested, and carried across millions of kilometers comes down to a very short window of about 7 minutes, where the spacecraft must slow from interplanetary speed to a complete stop on the surface. And if anything goes wrong in this window, there is no recovery option. The spacecraft arrives at Mars travelling at speeds that are typically between 5 and 7 kilometers per second, which is fast enough that if there were no atmosphere at all, it would pass straight into impact with the surface in a matter of minutes. But Mars does have an atmosphere, only it is extremely thin compared to Earth. And this creates a unique problem that engineers have to solve in a very precise way, because the atmosphere is thick enough to create heat and friction, but not thick enough to slow down a spacecraft on its own. This is where entry begins, and the spacecraft first hits the upper layers of the Martian atmosphere, which are so thin that they barely register compared to Earth's atmosphere. But even this thin layer begins to create resistance at such high speed that the outside of the spacecraft starts to heat up rapidly. And this heating is not gentle, it is extreme enough that the surface of the heat shield can reach temperatures that would destroy ordinary materials almost instantly if they were not specially designed for this moment. The heat shield is one of the most critical parts of the spacecraft during this phase, and it is designed to absorb and distribute the intense energy created by atmospheric friction as the spacecraft compresses air in front of it at hypersonic speeds. And this compression creates a layer of superheated gas around the vehicle that can reach plasma-like conditions, meaning the air itself becomes electrically charged and unstable. And during this period, communication with Earth is completely lost because the plasma blocks radio signals from passing through. This communication blackout is not a malfunction, it is expected, and it is often called the blackout phase, where the spacecraft is physically landing but completely disconnected from mission control. And during these few minutes, no one on Earth can see telemetry data, cannot send commands, and cannot intervene if something goes wrong, which means the spacecraft must complete every step of landing fully on its own, using pre-programmed systems and autonomous control. As the spacecraft continues deeper into the atmosphere, it begins to slow down slightly due to atmospheric drag. But this drag is nowhere near strong enough to bring it to a safe landing speed on its own, because Mars's atmosphere is about 1% the density of Earth's, which means it behaves more like a very thin fluid rather than a thick medium that can create strong resistance. And this is why parachutes alone cannot solve the landing problem. On Earth, parachutes work effectively because the air is dense enough to create strong drag forces that slow objects down from high altitude to safe landing speeds. But on Mars, even the largest parachutes can only reduce speed to a certain point, and after that point, the atmosphere becomes too thin to provide any additional meaningful slowdown, which means that even after parachute deployment, the spacecraft is still traveling far too fast to land safely. This creates one of the most difficult engineering requirements in planetary landing, which is supersonic deceleration, meaning the spacecraft must slow down from supersonic or hypersonic speeds to subsonic speeds in a controlled way, while still in a very thin atmosphere. And this is not something that can be achieved by passive systems alone. It requires active propulsion systems that can fire engines during descent to reduce speed further. This is where descent engines come into play, and they must ignite at exactly the right time, after parachutes have done their limited job. And these engines are often called retropropulsion systems because they fire in the opposite direction of motion to slow the spacecraft down, and they must operate with extreme precision because too much thrust can cause the spacecraft to rise again or become unstable, while too little thrust can result in a crash impact with the surface. During this phase, the spacecraft is transitioning through multiple stages of deceleration, starting from atmospheric entry, moving through heat shield braking, then parachute deployment, and finally powered descent using rockets. And each stage depends on the previous one working correctly, which means that failure in any single stage can make the entire landing sequence impossible to recover. One of the major challenges in this process is the timing of parachute deployment, because if parachutes open too early, they can be damaged by the high-speed airflow, and if they open too late, there is not enough time for them to reduce speed effectively. And this timing must account for atmospheric density variations that can change based on weather, dust levels, and seasonal conditions on Mars. Another major challenge is that Mars' atmosphere is not uniform. It contains variations in density depending on location, altitude, and time of day. And these variations affect how much drag is produced during entry, which means that every landing site requires its own detailed atmospheric modelling, and even small differences between expected and actual conditions can affect the final landing trajectory. As the spacecraft gets closer to the surface, it enters the final descent phase, where rockets take full control of the landing process, and this is where precision becomes absolutely critical, because the spacecraft must slow down from hundreds of meters per second to almost zero speed within a very short vertical distance, while also navigating toward a specific landing zone, avoiding hazards like rocks, slopes, or unstable ground. The engines used in this phase must be capable of firing in short bursts or continuous controlled thrust, depending on design, and they must adjust in real time based on sensor data that tracks altitude, speed, and surface conditions. And this entire system must operate autonomously because there is no time delay for human correction from Earth. Even small errors in this phase can lead to major failure outcomes, because if the spacecraft overshoots its landing zone, it may land in an area that is unsafe or unsuitable for operations, such as rocky terrain, steep slopes, or regions with unstable surface conditions. And once landed, there is no way to relocate the entire system to a better position. Overshoot is one of the failure modes that engineers must constantly account for, and it happens when the spacecraft does not slow down enough during descent or miscalculates its final braking distance, causing it to travel beyond the intended landing zone. And even if the spacecraft survives the landing itself, being in the wrong location can compromise mission success or make surface operations extremely difficult. Another major failure mode is crash impact, which happens when descent systems fail to reduce speeds sufficiently before reaching the surface. And at Mars, entry speeds, even small deviations in deceleration, can result in impact forces that destroy the spacecraft on contact, because there is no natural cushioning environment like a thick atmosphere or water surface to absorb excess energy. Only dry rocky terrain that does not give way. Parachute deployment failure is another critical risk, because if parachutes fail to open correctly, or open asymmetrically, or suffer structural damage during deployment, the spacecraft may lose stability or fail to slow down enough during the early descent phase, and this immediately increases reliance on engine braking, which may not always have enough time or fuel margin to compensate for the lost deceleration. All of these risks are compressed into a very short timeline, which is why this phase is often described as a 7-minute window of controlled survival. Because within this small period, the spacecraft must transition from interplanetary travel speed to a stable stationary position on the surface, and every second matters in a way that is far more intense than most other phases of space travel. During this descent, onboard systems are working at full capacity, sensors constantly measuring speed and altitude, computers adjusting thrust and trajectory, and structural components absorbing extreme thermal and mechanical stress. And all of this happens without external input, because communication delay makes real-time control impossible. By the time the spacecraft reaches the final seconds before touchdown, it is moving slowly compared to its entry speed, but still fast enough that even a small miscalculation could cause serious damage, and the landing legs must deploy and absorb the final impact energy in a controlled way that prevents tipping, bouncing, or structural collapse. Once contact is made with the surface, the spacecraft must immediately stabilize itself, because even a small tilt can affect internal systems, solar panel deployment, or communication alignment with Earth. And this stabilization is not just mechanical, it is also operational, because the success of the entire mission depends on whether the spacecraft can transition from descent mode to surface operations without failure. Mars surface reality check. The moment a human finally stands on the surface of Mars, there is no gradual adjustment period, no natural easing into the environment, and no sense that the planet will allow the body to adapt over time, because everything about the surface is already fixed in a state that does not support human life in any natural way. And this is the first thing that must be understood clearly, not as theory, but as a physical fact that does not change no matter how advanced the mission technology becomes. The air is the first and most immediate problem, because there is no breathable air in any usable sense, and what exists above the surface is an atmosphere made almost entirely of carbon dioxide, around 95%, with only traces of other gases that do not provide oxygen in meaningful amounts. And this means that every breath a human takes outside a sealed system is not just useless, it is dangerous, because the body cannot extract oxygen from the environment at all, and without a suit or habitat system supplying oxygen directly, survival becomes impossible within a very short time window. This is not a situation where breathing becomes difficult over minutes or hours. It is a situation where the body is immediately cut off from oxygen supply the moment a sealed system fails. And because human biology depends continuously on oxygen delivery to the brain and organs, the limit for survival without a suit is measured in seconds to a few minutes at most. depending on exposure conditions, physical state, and remaining oxygen reserves in the bloodstream. And even within that short time frame, cognitive function begins to fail quickly as oxygen levels drop. At the same time, the pressure of the atmosphere is far too low to support human life, sitting at less than 1% of Earth's sea level pressure, which means that even if oxygen were somehow present in small amounts, the pressure difference alone would still make normal breathing impossible, because the human body is adapted to operate under a stable pressure environment, and without that pressure, internal fluids cannot remain stable in the same way, and exposed liquids in the body begin to behave unpredictably under such low pressure conditions. This is why Mars cannot be treated as a place where humans can simply wear oxygen masks or partial protection systems, because oxygen alone is not enough. Pressure is equally important, and both must be fully controlled in order to maintain human survival, which leads directly to the concept of the habitat, where life support is not optional or supportive, but absolutely essential at every moment of survival. On the surface of Mars, survival is completely dependent on habitat integrity, meaning that the sealed environment inside a habitat becomes the only reason humans can exist there at all. And this includes everything from air composition to temperature control to pressure regulation to radiation shielding. And if any one of these systems fails in a serious way, the internal environment begins to degrade rapidly, and there is no external backup system available to replace what is lost. The habitat is not just a shelter, it is a full life support system that must replicate Earth-like conditions in a controlled way, maintaining pressure close to 1 atmosphere, supplying oxygen continuously, removing carbon dioxide efficiently, managing humidity, filtering dust particles, and controlling temperature within safe limits, all at the same time. And this must continue without interruption for the entire duration of the mission, which could last months or even years, depending on mission design. Inside this pressurized habitat, the air must be carefully managed, because humans continuously consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. And without a system to remove CO2 and replace oxygen, the internal atmosphere would quickly become toxic or unbreathable. And this is why CO2 scrubbing systems are one of the most critical parts of any Mars habitat design, because they act as the lungs of the entire system, continuously cleaning the air so that it remains safe for breathing. These scrubbing systems work by filtering carbon dioxide from the air and either storing it or converting it into other compounds, while oxygen generation systems must simultaneously replace the oxygen being used by the crew. And in some designs, this oxygen can be produced from Martian resources, such as extracting oxygen from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere using machines similar to experimental systems like MOXIE. But scaling these systems from experimental prototypes to full mission support systems is a major engineering challenge. The limitation is not just whether oxygen can be produced, but whether it can be produced reliably, continuously, and in sufficient quantity to support a full crew over long durations, because experimental systems are designed to prove feasibility, not to guarantee uninterrupted supply under all possible conditions. And this difference becomes critical when human survival depends entirely on system stability. At the same time, CO2 scrubbing systems also face their own risks, because they rely on mechanical and chemical processes that must operate continuously without failure, and any degradation in these systems can lead to gradual buildup of carbon dioxide inside the habitat, which does not immediately cause collapse, but slowly reduces cognitive function, increases fatigue, and can become life-threatening if not corrected in time. This creates a situation where both oxygen generation and carbon dioxide removal are tightly linked systems that must operate in perfect balance. And if one side begins to fail, the other side cannot compensate indefinitely, which makes the entire life support system highly sensitive to small disruptions or component failures. Beyond air management, the habitat must also maintain pressure at levels close to Earth normal, around 1 atmosphere, because human biology is adapted to that pressure range, and even small deviations over time can cause discomfort, physiological stress, or system strain, and maintaining this pressure requires strong structural design because the habitat is essentially a sealed vessel constantly pushing outward against the low pressure of Mars's atmosphere. This structural requirement is not just about strength, it is about long-term stability, because the habitat must maintain pressure without slow leaks, material fatigue, or micro damage from dust or radiation exposure. And even very small leaks become serious over time, because they can gradually reduce internal pressure or require continuous energy use to compensate, which increases system load and reduces safety margins. Radiation shielding also becomes part of the habitat design because, unlike Earth, there is no natural atmospheric layer to reduce radiation exposure. So the habitat itself must provide protection, often through thick walls, buried structures, or use of surrounding soil material. But even these solutions reduce exposure rather than eliminate it, which means that the habitat is not a perfect shield, but a controlled reduction environment where radiation is managed rather than removed. Inside this sealed system, every component is part of a single integrated survival network where air, pressure, temperature, and radiation protection are all connected. And if one system fails, it can affect the others quickly. Because the habitat is not made of independent safety layers, it is a tightly linked structure where each function depends on the stability of the others. This leads directly to the concept of single point of failure architecture risk, which is one of the most serious concerns in Mars habitat design, because many life support systems do not have full redundancy due to weight, energy, and resource limitations, which means that some systems may represent critical points where failure cannot be easily recovered from without external support or backup hardware. A single point failure means that one system component, if it stops working, can bring down an entire function of the habitat, and in some cases, multiple functions at once, such as if oxygen generation fails, or pressure regulation fails, or CO2 scrubbing fails. And unlike Earth environments where backup systems and repair infrastructure are widely available, Mars habitats must rely on limited onboard repair capacity and stored spare parts, which are always finite. Outside the habitat, the environment remains completely hostile at all times, and this becomes especially clear during extravehicular activity, where astronauts leave the pressurized environment and enter the surface directly in suits. And even though suits are highly advanced and carefully engineered systems, they are still temporary life support systems that provide a limited window of survival rather than a stable environment. During EVA operations, survival time without a suit is not measured in hours or long durations. It is measured in seconds to minutes, depending on exposure conditions, because without pressure and oxygen supply, the human body cannot maintain normal function. And this means that every EVA operation must be carefully planned, timed, and executed with strict limits on duration and exposure risk. Even within a suit, astronauts are operating in a highly controlled system where oxygen supply, temperature regulation, and pressure maintenance are all actively managed. And if any one of these systems inside the suit fails, the situation can become critical very quickly, because there is no external atmosphere to support partial survival or gradual recovery. Water, scarcity and extraction, failure, risk. Martian dust is not like dust on Earth. It is much finer, almost like powdered ash, and because of its size, it behaves almost like a fluid when it moves. It can float in the thin atmosphere for long periods and then settle into every possible gap. And once it settles, it does not just sit harmlessly, it interacts with surfaces in ways that make it stick strongly, partly because of electrostatic forces, which means the dust particles can carry small electrical charges that cause them to cling to materials like metal, glass, fabric, seals, and mechanical joints. This electrostatic dust adhesion is one of the biggest hidden problems for Mars systems, because it means cleaning is not simple. It is not like brushing off dirt. It behaves more like the dust is slowly locking itself onto surfaces, and every time something moves, opens, closes, rotates, or seals, a small amount of dust gets pulled into places it should never go. And over time, this builds up in layers that affect performance. Inside mechanical systems, this dust becomes a serious issue because it gets into moving parts, seals and joints, and Mars equipment depends heavily on precision sealing to maintain pressure inside habitats and suits, so even a very small amount of contamination can slowly increase wear and tear. And when dust builds up inside joints or hinges, it creates friction where there should be smooth movement. And this friction increases energy use, reduces efficiency, and raises the risk of mechanical failure. Filters are another major point of stress because every habitat and suit depends on air filtration systems to keep breathable air clean. And Martian dust is extremely fine, which means it can pass into filter systems quickly and clog them faster than expected if the system is not designed for high load conditions. And when filters clog, airflow decreases, energy use increases, and system stress rises across the entire life support chain because everything depends on steady air circulation. Seals are especially vulnerable because they are designed to hold pressure differences between inside and outside environments, and on Mars the pressure difference is extreme. So seals are already under constant mechanical stress, and when dust gets into seal surfaces, it can prevent full closure or create micro gaps, and even a tiny gap in a pressurized system becomes a slow leak that must be constantly compensated by energy systems, which adds long-term strain on power resources. Then there is the chemical side of Martian dust, which is just as important as the physical side, because the dust contains perchlorates, which are chemical compounds that are toxic to humans, especially if they accumulate in the body or enter the water supply system. And this creates another layer of risk that is not just mechanical, but biological. Perchlorates are particularly dangerous because they can interfere with thyroid function in the human body, and the thyroid is responsible for regulating metabolism and energy balance, which means that long-term exposure to perchlorates can affect how the body processes energy, regulates temperature, and maintains normal biological cycles. And while small exposure levels might not cause immediate effects, repeated exposure over time becomes a concern in closed environments like Mars habitats. One of the most serious risks is water contamination, because Mars missions rely heavily on recycling and extracting water from local sources such as subsurface ice. And if perchlorates or dust particles enter water systems, they must be carefully filtered and removed. Otherwise, they can enter the crew's drinking supply. And in a closed-loop system where water is constantly recycled, even small contamination events can spread through the entire system if not detected early. This is where the concept of contamination loops becomes important, because once dust enters a habitat system, it does not stay in one place. It spreads through air circulation, equipment contact, suit transfers, and water handling systems, meaning that contamination is not a single point problem. It becomes a network problem, where one entry point can slowly affect multiple systems over time if not managed continuously. Every time astronauts enter or exit the habitat, they bring dust with them, even with cleaning procedures, because Mars dust is so fine that it can cling to suit surfaces, joints, and fabric layers. And once inside, it spreads through airflow systems unless fully contained. And this makes dust management not just a cleaning task, but a continuous operational requirement. Now moving to water, which is one of the most critical survival resources on Mars. Because without water, there is no life support system, no drinking supply, no oxygen production support, and no food production system, and every aspect of human survival depends either directly or indirectly on water availability, which makes it one of the most important resources to secure and maintain. Unlike Earth, Mars does not have easily accessible liquid water on the surface, because the low pressure and low temperature conditions make stable liquid water almost impossible at surface level. So water exists mainly in frozen form underground, or trapped in soil and mineral structures, which means it must be extracted rather than collected. Subsurface ice extraction is one of the main proposed methods for obtaining water on Mars, and this involves drilling into the ground to reach layers where ice is stored beneath the surface, then heating or processing that ice to convert it into liquid water. which can then be purified and used for life support systems. But this process is not simple because the location, depth and purity of ice deposits can vary widely depending on region. Drilling itself is a major engineering challenge on Mars because the equipment must operate in cold, dusty, low-pressure conditions and must be reliable enough to function without frequent maintenance, and unlike drilling on Earth, where support infrastructure is available, on Mars, any drilling failure can delay or stop water access completely until repair or replacement is possible, which may not be immediate. Once ice is extracted, it must be melted and purified, which requires energy. And energy on Mars is a limited resource that must be carefully managed between life support, heating, communication and mobility systems. So water production is not just a mechanical process, it is an energy balancing problem where every unit of water produced has a direct energy cost attached to it. This energy cost becomes critical during periods when solar power is reduced, such as during dust storms or seasonal changes. And if energy availability drops too low, water production systems may slow down or stop temporarily, which creates pressure on stored reserves. And in a closed environment, stored reserves are always limited and must be carefully planned. Water purification is another important step, because Martian water sources may contain dust particles, chemical compounds like perchlorates and other impurities that must be removed before the water can be used safely for drinking or oxygen production. And purification systems must operate continuously with high reliability, because even small contamination in a closed-loop system can spread quickly. There are several system failure scenarios that engineers must plan for when dealing with water extraction, and one of the most serious is drilling failure, where the equipment cannot reach or access ice deposits due to mechanical breakdown, incorrect location data, or unstable ground conditions. And if drilling fails, the entire water supply chain becomes dependent on stored reserves and recycling efficiency until the problem is solved. Another failure scenario is contamination, where dust or chemical compounds enter the water system faster than purification systems can remove them. And this can reduce water quality or force shutdowns for cleaning and repair, which reduces available water supply and increases operational stress on the crew. Energy shortage is also a major failure scenario because water extraction, melting and purification all require continuous energy input. And if energy production drops due to dust-covered solar panels, equipment failure or environmental conditions, water production can slow or stop, creating a direct link between power systems and survival resources. What makes both dust and water systems so critical together is that they are deeply connected, because dust affects water systems through contamination, filtration load, and mechanical wear, while water systems depend on dust control to maintain purity and system efficiency, which means that a failure in one area can directly increase stress in the other. Inside a Mars habitat, these systems do not operate independently. They function as part of a single survival network where air, water, energy, and mechanical systems all depend on each other to maintain balance. And when dust begins to build up or water systems begin to struggle, the effects spread across multiple systems rather than staying isolated. Power systems, the lifeline that can collapse everything. Food on Mars cannot come from soil in the normal Earth sense, because Martian soil is not ready for farming in its natural state. It contains chemical compounds like perchlorates. It has no active biological ecosystem, and it does not hold nutrients in a balanced way that plants can naturally use. So the only realistic method for growing food in early missions is controlled agriculture systems. And the most likely system for this is hydroponics, where plants grow in water solutions that are carefully controlled and enriched with nutrients, rather than growing in natural soil. In hydroponic systems, plants are supported by artificial structures while their roots are placed in nutrient-rich water. And this allows precise control over what the plants receive, including minerals, water levels, and oxygen supply for the roots. And this level of control is necessary on Mars because there is no natural ecosystem to rely on for balance. Everything must be managed manually or by automated systems that constantly adjust conditions to keep plants alive and growing. But hydroponic systems are not simple to maintain, especially in a Mars environment, because they depend on constant circulation of water, stable temperature control, and precise nutrient balance. And if any of these factors go out of range, plant growth slows down or stops completely. And in a closed environment where food supply is limited, even a short interruption in plant growth can create long-term problems for crew nutrition. The artificial lighting used for plant growth becomes one of the most important parts of the system, because Mars does have sunlight, but it is weaker than Earth sunlight due to distance from the sun and atmospheric conditions, and relying only on natural sunlight would not provide stable or predictable energy for consistent plant growth cycles. So most controlled agriculture systems must use artificial lighting to simulate optimal growing conditions. These artificial lights are not just simple bulbs, they are carefully tuned systems that provide specific wavelengths of light that plants use for photosynthesis, often using LED technology that can be adjusted to match plant needs. But these lighting systems require large amounts of electrical energy, and this energy demand becomes a major pressure point on the entire Mars-based power system. Every plant grown in a Mars habitat becomes an energy calculation, because light must be provided for many hours per day. Water must be circulated continuously, and temperature must be controlled within a narrow range, and all of this depends on power systems that already have to support life support, communication, heating, and equipment operation. So food production is never just agriculture. It is always part of a larger energy budget that must be carefully balanced. This is where crop failure risk loops begin to appear. Because if power supply drops even slightly, artificial lighting reduces, plant growth slows, oxygen production from plants may decrease, and food production output drops, which then puts more pressure on stored food reserves. And if this continues, it can lead to a cycle where reduced energy leads to reduced food production, which increases stress on crew systems and makes recovery harder over time. Hydroponic systems also depend on nutrient recycling, because on Mars there is no natural soil cycle to replace lost nutrients. So everything must be recycled from waste streams, including human waste processing systems, plant waste breakdown systems, and chemical nutrient recovery processes. And this creates a closed-loop system where almost every input must be reused multiple times to maintain balance. But nutrient recycling is not perfect, because not all materials can be fully recovered. Some nutrients degrade over time, some are lost in processing, and some systems may not extract everything efficiently, which means that over long missions, there is a gradual risk of nutrient imbalance, unless additional supplies are brought from Earth or carefully managed replenishment systems are used. This makes food production on Mars not just about growing crops, but about maintaining a delicate balance between input and output systems, where every plant cycle depends on precise chemical stability, and small changes in system performance can slowly affect food quality, growth rates, and total yield over time. Another layer of complexity comes from the psychological effects of limited diet cycles, because on Mars, food variety is not like Earth, where people can access unlimited types of ingredients from global supply chains. Instead, food is limited to what is grown inside the habitat or stored from Earth's supplies. And over time, this creates repetitive diet patterns where astronauts eat similar foods over long periods. Even if nutritional requirements are fully met, psychological fatigue from limited food variety can affect crew morale, appetite, and overall mental well-being. Because eating is not just a biological function, it is also a behavioural experience that is closely tied to comfort, routine, and emotional stability. And when variety is reduced, food can start to feel repetitive in ways that affect long-term living conditions inside confined environments. In addition to food systems, power systems on Mars become the central lifeline of the entire base, because without power, nothing else functions, and every system depends on continuous energy flow, including oxygen production, water extraction, temperature control, communication systems, computing systems, and agricultural lighting, which means that power is not just one part of the infrastructure, it is the foundation that holds everything else together. One of the main power sources considered for Mars missions is solar energy, because sunlight is available across most of the planet, and solar panels can generate electricity during daylight hours. But this system has a major weakness on Mars, which is dust storms, because fine dust in the atmosphere can cover solar panels and reduce their efficiency dramatically, sometimes to very low levels if cleaning systems are not active or if storms last for extended periods. Mars dust storms can vary in size, from local storms that affect small regions to global storms that can cover large portions of the planet for weeks at a time. And during these global dust storms, sunlight reaching the surface can drop significantly, which means solar panel output can fall to levels that are not sufficient to maintain full base operations without backup systems. Solar panel degradation is not just about reduced light, it is also about dust accumulation on the panel surfaces, which creates a layer that blocks sunlight even after the storm passes. And if dust is not removed efficiently, panels may remain partially blocked, reducing long-term energy efficiency and increasing maintenance requirements for cleaning systems that themselves require power to operate. Because of these limitations, nuclear power systems are also considered for Mars missions, especially systems like radioisotope thermoelectric generators, RTGs, or small fission reactors, which can provide continuous energy output regardless of sunlight conditions. And this makes them valuable as stable base power sources that do not depend on weather or daylight cycles. RTGs generate heat from radioactive decay and convert it into electricity, and they are reliable over long periods but provide limited power output, which may not be enough for large-scale habitats or agriculture systems alone, while fission reactors can produce much higher power levels and are better suited for supporting full base operations, but they come with engineering complexity, safety requirements, and deployment challenges that must be carefully managed. In many mission designs, a combination of solar and nuclear power is considered, where solar systems handle normal daytime operations and nuclear systems provide baseline continuous power or backup during dust storms. But even this combined system still requires careful planning, because power demand on Mars is not static. It changes constantly depending on mission activity, environmental conditions, and system health. Dust storm blackout scenarios are one of the most serious risks for Mars power systems, because during global storms that last for weeks, solar power can drop significantly, and if nuclear backup is not sufficient or not available, the entire base may have to enter low power mode, where non-essential systems are shut down to preserve energy for life support, and this includes reducing lighting, limiting mobility operations, and minimizing non-critical computing tasks. In low-power scenarios, food production systems may slow down or pause, water extraction may be reduced, and habitat systems must prioritize essential functions like air pressure, oxygen supply, and temperature control, which creates a highly constrained environment where every system must compete for limited energy resources, and decisions must be made about what continues running and what must be temporarily reduced. This creates a tightly connected system where food production and power systems are directly linked, because food requires energy to grow, and energy systems depend on stable operation of infrastructure that is itself affected by environmental conditions like dust storms, which means that Mars survival is not just about having individual systems, but about keeping all systems balanced at the same time without letting one failure cascade into another. Communication. Delay 4 to 24 minutes of isolation. When humans think about space missions, they often imagine control rooms on Earth guiding every move in real time, where engineers watch screens and correct problems instantly. But once a mission reaches Mars, that idea breaks completely, not because technology stops working, but because physics itself puts a hard limit on communication speed, and this creates a delay that changes everything about how decisions are made, how emergencies are handled, and how safe humans can actually be when they are that far away. The signal between Earth and Mars travels at the speed of light, which is extremely fast in human terms, but space is so large that even light takes time to cross it. And depending on the position of the two planets in their orbits, the distance between them constantly changes, which means communication delay is never fixed. It shifts over time and can range from about 4 minutes at the closest alignment to as much as 24 minutes one way at the farthest separation. And this is not round-trip delay, this is just one direction. This means that when someone on Earth sends a message to Mars, the astronauts will receive it several minutes later. And when the astronauts respond, that response also takes several minutes to return. So a simple question and answer exchange can take half an hour or more, and this is not a rare situation. This is the normal communication rhythm for the entire mission once Mars is far from Earth in orbital position. This delay changes everything about mission control because real-time conversation is no longer possible, and Earth-based teams cannot guide every step of operations as they do in low Earth orbit missions like those on the International Space Station, where communication is almost instant and ground control can step in quickly if something goes wrong. On Mars, mission control becomes more like a delayed support system rather than an active controller, where instructions are sent ahead of time, procedures are planned in detail, and astronauts must make decisions on their own based on conditions in front of them rather than waiting for approval or correction from Earth. And this shift is not just technical, it is operational and psychological at the same time. This creates a strong requirement for autonomy, meaning that systems on Mars must be able to operate independently without constant human correction from Earth. And astronauts themselves must be trained to handle complex situations without immediate external guidance, because waiting for instructions is often not possible when conditions change quickly. Autonomy applies not only to decision-making, but also to spacecraft systems, habitat controls, life support monitoring, navigation and emergency responses, because every system must be capable of detecting problems and reacting in real time without needing Earth input. And this increases the complexity of onboard systems significantly, because they must handle both normal operation and unexpected failure conditions automatically. The failure risk in autonomy systems becomes one of the most important hidden dangers of Mars missions, because when systems are designed to operate independently, they must make decisions without human oversight in real time. And if those systems misinterpret data or respond incorrectly to unusual conditions, there is no immediate way for Earth to correct the mistake before consequences develop. Inside a Mars habitat or spacecraft, this means that a large part of survival depends on software logic, sensor accuracy, and automated control systems that must function continuously without interruption. And even small software errors or sensor malfunctions can lead to incorrect decisions in life support systems, pressure control, or oxygen regulation. This communication delay also affects emergency response, because on Earth, if a medical or technical emergency happens, experts can be consulted instantly. But on Mars, any consultation with Earth-based doctors or engineers takes minutes or even tens of minutes for a response, which means that immediate action must be taken by the crew without waiting for guidance. This becomes especially critical in medical emergencies, where time is a major factor in survival outcomes, and one of the most serious examples often discussed in Mars mission planning is appendicitis, which on Earth is a treatable condition with relatively routine surgery. But on Mars, it becomes a potential life-threatening event due to limited medical infrastructure and delayed external support. Appendicitis is an inflammation of the appendix, and if it progresses without treatment, it can lead to rupture and infection spreading inside the body. And while modern medicine can treat this effectively with surgery and antibiotics on Earth, on Mars the situation is very different, because there is no full hospital environment, no large surgical team, and no rapid evacuation option back to Earth. If a crew member develops appendicitis on Mars, the medical response must happen inside the habitat or spacecraft using limited medical equipment. And this means that surgery would need to be performed in a low-resource environment, where conditions are controlled but not equivalent to a full hospital operating room, and where the available tools, sterilisation systems and support equipment are all limited by what was brought on the mission. Performing surgery in a low-gravity environment adds another layer of complexity. Because fluids behave differently in reduced gravity, instruments must be carefully secured, and maintaining a sterile environment becomes more difficult because every movement and airflow pattern inside the habitat must be controlled precisely to avoid contamination. And this increases the difficulty of even routine medical procedures compared to Earth standards. Medical teams on Mars would need to rely heavily on remote guidance systems, but because of communication delay, real-time guidance from Earth-based surgeons is not possible, so instructions would arrive in delayed segments, and decisions would often need to be made before full consultation is completed, which places full responsibility on the crew medical officer to act quickly and correctly under pressure. In addition to surgical emergencies, there is also the ongoing risk of infection inside closed-loop habitats, where humans live in tightly controlled environments with recycled air and water. And while these systems are designed to be safe, the confined nature of the habitat means that once a pathogen enters the system, it can spread more easily compared to open environments on Earth. Closed-loop habitats are carefully monitored, but they are still limited ecosystems, and infection control depends on strict hygiene, air filtration and medical protocols. And even then, small microbial imbalances can develop over time, especially in environments where humans are isolated for long periods, and microbial communities evolve differently than on Earth. Another major concern in Mars missions is pharmaceutical shelf life degradation, because medications carried from Earth must remain stable over long periods. But exposure to radiation in space and on Mars can slowly degrade certain compounds, reducing their effectiveness over time, and this becomes a serious issue when dealing with long-duration missions where resupply is not possible. Radiation exposure can affect the chemical stability of drugs, altering their molecular structure or reducing potency, which means that medications stored for emergencies may not always perform exactly as expected after long periods in space conditions, and this adds uncertainty to medical planning because the effectiveness of critical treatments must be assumed rather than guaranteed over the full duration of the mission. In a Mars environment, this combination of communication delay, limited medical infrastructure, surgical complexity, infection risk, and pharmaceutical degradation creates a medical system that is fundamentally different from Earth healthcare, because instead of relying on hospitals, specialists, and immediate emergency response, survival depends on a small onboard medical system that must handle everything from minor injuries to life-threatening conditions without external assistance in real time. This shifts the entire structure of medical safety from a reactive system supported by large infrastructure to a proactive system where prevention, preparation, and immediate onboard response become the only reliable defense. And every medical decision carries higher weight because there is no fast external correction available if something goes wrong. Even routine health monitoring becomes more important in this environment because early detection of medical issues is critical when treatment options are limited, and astronauts must continuously monitor their own health status and report changes early, because waiting for symptoms to worsen before acting is far more dangerous on Mars than on Earth. Inside this system, time itself becomes a limiting factor in a way that is not normally experienced on Earth, because communication delay means that even information moves slowly between planets, and in emergencies, those minutes of delay can determine whether a situation is manageable or becomes critical before help or guidance can arrive. Psychological breakdown in isolation. Long before any mechanical system on Mars fails, oxygen levels drop or power systems shut down, there is another kind of pressure that starts building quietly inside the crew, and it is not visible on sensors or dashboards. It is psychological strain caused by isolation, confinement, and environmental stress that slowly changes how people think, react, and relate to each other over time. And this is one of the most underestimated risks of Mars missions, because it does not show up as a single failure event. It builds gradually until normal behaviour starts to shift in ways that are hard to predict or fully control. The first layer of this psychological pressure comes from sensory deprivation, because Mars is not just distant, it is visually and physically limited in stimulation. And even though astronauts are still working, moving and performing tasks, their entire world is reduced to a small enclosed habitat and a controlled exterior environment that does not change in the way Earth environments naturally do. And over time, the human brain begins to notice the lack of variety in sensory input. On Earth, the brain constantly receives changing signals, different sounds, wind, weather patterns, crowds, natural movement, and unpredictable environmental changes. But on Mars, especially inside habitats, the environment becomes stable and repetitive, with controlled temperature, filtered air, constant lighting, and predictable sounds from machines. And this stability, while necessary for survival, creates a form of sensory reduction, where the brain is no longer exposed to natural variation. This reduction in sensory input does not immediately cause visible problems, but over long durations it can affect mental processing, attention levels, and emotional regulation. Because the human brain is adapted to environments where constant change is normal, and when that change is removed or heavily reduced, cognitive patterns can begin to shift in subtle ways that affect mood and perception of time. As isolation continues, group dynamics become another major factor, because astronauts are not only isolated from Earth, they are isolated with each other for long periods of time, inside a confined environment where there is no physical escape from social interaction. And this creates a situation where even small interpersonal tensions can become amplified over time. On Mars missions, crew members must work closely together in high-pressure environments where every task depends on cooperation and coordination. But in long-duration isolation, even small differences in communication style, work habits, or stress responses can become more noticeable. And because there is no external social environment to reset these interactions, they can accumulate gradually and affect group harmony. Group conflict amplification does not always appear as open arguments. It can appear as small communication breakdowns, reduced patience, or subtle changes in interaction patterns. And over time, these small changes can affect team efficiency, decision-making speed, and emotional stability within the group, especially when combined with environmental stress and workload pressure. Another major factor is sleep cycle disruption, because Mars has a day length that is slightly different from Earth, with a sol lasting about 24 hours and 39 minutes. And while this difference seems small, it is enough to affect human circadian rhythms over long periods if not carefully managed. The human body is strongly tied to Earth's natural light-dark cycle, and even small changes in daily timing can affect sleep quality, alertness, hormone regulation, and recovery cycles. So on Mars, maintaining a stable sleep schedule requires artificial light control and strict scheduling. But even with these controls, the mismatch between Earth-based biological rhythms and Mars day length can still create gradual adjustment stress. Over time, this can lead to sleep cycle instability, where sleep becomes less predictable or less restorative. And when sleep quality decreases, cognitive performance, emotional regulation, and decision-making ability can also be affected, which becomes especially important in high-risk environments where precision and attention are critical for survival operations. Long-duration confinement stress is another major psychological factor, and this is where real-world analogues on Earth become important for understanding what might happen on Mars. Because environments like Antarctica research stations and submarine missions provide some of the closest comparisons to Mars-like isolation, even though they are still far less extreme in terms of distance and environmental hostility. In Antarctic stations, crews live in isolated conditions for months at a time with limited external contact, extreme weather conditions, and confined living spaces, and studies from these environments show that over time, people can experience changes in mood, motivation, and social interaction patterns, especially during long winter periods where external environment becomes visually uniform and unchanging. Submarine missions provide another useful comparison, because submarines also involve long periods of confinement in enclosed environments with limited privacy, controlled air systems, and constant operational pressure. And these missions show that even highly trained crews can experience stress responses over time, when isolated in small groups under continuous operational demands. Mars missions combine both of these factors and extend them further, because unlike Antarctica or submarines, Mars also includes extreme environmental danger outside the habitat, which means that isolation is not just social or physical, it is also environmental, because stepping outside the habitat requires life support systems that must function perfectly at all times. This combination of confinement, isolation, and environmental risks creates a psychological environment where stress is not occasional but continuous, and where the mind must constantly adapt to a situation that does not allow normal escape or reset conditions. And this is why mental resilience becomes as important as technical skill in long-duration space missions. At the same time, Mars introduces another layer of stress through dust storm survival scenarios, which are not just visual events, but full environmental system challenges that can affect power, communication, visibility, and habitat stability at the same time. Global dust storms on Mars can cover large portions of the planet and last for weeks, and during these storms, sunlight reaching the surface can drop significantly, which directly affects solar power generation. And when solar energy drops, every system that depends on it begins to experience pressure, including life support systems, heating systems, water processing, and food production systems. This creates a cascade effect where power drop leads to reduced energy availability, which then affects oxygen production systems that require electricity to operate. And as oxygen systems become constrained, habitat support systems must prioritize essential functions, which can include shutting down or reducing non-essential operations to preserve energy for life-critical systems. As energy availability decreases, temperature control systems may also become less effective, which can lead to gradual drops in internal habitat temperature if backup systems are not sufficient. And while habitats are designed with insulation and thermal stability in mind, long-duration energy shortages can still create stress on temperature regulation systems. In extreme scenarios, this cascade effect can continue across multiple systems, where power reduction leads to oxygen constraints. Oxygen constraints lead to reduced operational capacity, and combined system stress can increase overall risk levels inside the habitat, making careful energy management essential during extended dust storm periods. Visibility during dust storms can also drop to near zero conditions on the surface, which affects not only external operations, but also psychological perception of the environment, because outside the habitat, familiar landmarks disappear. Navigation becomes more difficult, and even short EVA operations become more risky due to reduced visual feedback. Inside the habitat, dust storms are not directly visible in the same way, but their effects are felt through system changes, reduced power availability, and operational adjustments, which creates an indirect awareness of external conditions that can still influence psychological stress levels, because the crew is constantly aware that the external environment is in a highly unstable state. When dust storms last for extended periods, the combination of reduced external activity, limited power usage, and confined indoor operations can increase feelings of monotony and environmental pressure, because the crew must remain inside for longer durations without normal external work cycles, and this further reinforces the effects of isolation and confinement. Habitat breach, the most realistic death event. On Mars, the most dangerous moments are not always the dramatic ones. Like landing or dust storms or radiation bursts, the most dangerous moment is often the quiet kind, the kind that starts inside a system that was supposed to protect life. Because once humans are living on Mars, everything depends on one thing holding steady: the sealed habitat. And the reality is that this sealed environment is constantly under pressure from forces that are trying to break it open in very small but continuous ways. And when people talk about the most realistic way a Mars mission could fail, it is not usually a big explosion or sudden crash. It is a habitat breach, a loss of pressure integrity, a failure of the thin barrier that separates human life from vacuum. The habitat is built to hold an internal pressure close to Earth normal, around 1 atmosphere, while outside there is almost no pressure at all, which creates a constant outward force pushing on every wall, every joint, every seal, every window, and every connection point. And this difference in pressure is not small, it is extreme, and it means that the entire structure is always under stress. Even when nothing is happening, even when everything looks stable, the habitat is still fighting against physics that want to expand it outward. One of the hidden risks that engineers must account for is micrometeorite penetration. Because space is not empty, it is filled with tiny particles travelling at extremely high speeds. And even though Mars has an atmosphere, it is not thick enough to fully protect the surface from these particles, which means small micrometeorites can still reach the ground and impact structures. And when they do not behave like slow-moving debris. They strike at velocities that can puncture materials that are not specifically designed to absorb such energy. A micrometeorite does not need to be large to cause serious damage. Even a grain-sized particle travelling at orbital speed carries enough kinetic energy to create a tiny puncture in a surface, and if that surface is part of a habitat wall, that small puncture becomes a pressure leak. And a pressure leak on Mars is not like a leak on Earth. It does not just reduce comfort or efficiency, it directly affects survival, because the entire internal environment depends on maintaining pressure stability. The difficulty is that micrometeorite impacts are unpredictable in timing and location. They can happen at any moment. And while habitats are designed with shielding layers and protective materials to reduce this risk, no system can fully eliminate it, only reduce the probability. Which means that over time, the risk remains present as a constant background possibility that must always be monitored and managed. Another major cause of habitat breach risk comes from thermal cycling, which is the repeated expansion and contraction of materials due to extreme temperature changes on Mars, where surface temperatures can shift from around -100 degrees Celsius at night to above 20 degrees Celsius during the day in some regions. And this range of temperature change puts continuous stress on structural materials. When materials expand and contract repeatedly, even slightly over long periods, microscopic cracks can form in joints, seals, and connection points, and these cracks are often too small to detect immediately. But they can slowly grow over time, especially in environments where there is constant temperature cycling every day. And this means that the structure of the habitat is not static. It is slowly changing at a microscopic level with each thermal cycle. Seal failure is one of the most important risks connected to thermal cycling because seals are what maintain pressure integrity between inside and outside environments, and even a small degradation in seal performance can lead to slow leakage. And slow leakage is dangerous because it may not be immediately noticeable, but it gradually reduces internal pressure over time, requiring life support systems to compensate constantly, which increases system load and reduces safety margins. Over time, a small leak can become a larger problem if not detected early, because pressure differences continue to stress the weak point, and once a seal begins to fail, the process can accelerate, especially under repeated thermal stress, which makes early detection and repair absolutely critical in Mars habitats. When a habitat breach does occur, one of the most dangerous physical processes that follows is rapid decompression, which is the sudden loss of internal pressure when the sealed environment is open to the near vacuum of Mars. And this process is extremely fast, happening in seconds or minutes depending on the size of the breach. And it creates immediate changes in air movement, pressure distribution, and structural stress inside the habitat. During rapid decompression, air inside the habitat rushes toward the opening because it moves from high pressure to low pressure instantly. And this creates strong airflow that can pull objects, dust, and even people toward the breach point if the opening is large enough. And this movement is not gentle. It is forceful and chaotic because the pressure difference is so large that air is effectively trying to escape as quickly as possible. At the same time, the internal pressure drop causes oxygen levels inside the habitat to fall rapidly, and human survival becomes time critical because the body cannot function normally without sufficient oxygen pressure, and as pressure decreases, oxygen availability to the brain drops quickly, leading to loss of consciousness in a very short time window if the situation is not controlled immediately. The time to failure in a habitat breach is measured in seconds to minutes, not hours. Because once a significant pressure loss begins, the environment becomes increasingly unlivable very quickly. And the only chance of survival depends on immediate response systems, emergency sealing procedures, and crew action that can isolate the breach before the entire habitat loses pressure. Modern habitat designs include compartmentalization strategies, where the habitat is divided into sections that can be sealed off from each other, so that if one section experiences a breach, the rest of the habitat can be isolated and preserved. But this system only works if the breach is detected quickly, and if sealing mechanisms activate correctly under pressure conditions, which adds another layer of system dependency. Detection systems must constantly monitor pressure levels, air composition, and structural integrity, because early detection is the only way to prevent full habitat loss, and even small delays in detection can change the outcome of a breach event, because once decompression accelerates, it becomes harder to stop without rapid isolation of the affected section. Emergency response systems inside the habitat are designed to activate automatically when pressure drops are detected, closing internal bulkheads, sealing doors, and redirecting life support systems to maintain survivable conditions in unaffected areas. But these systems also depend on power, sensors, and mechanical reliability, which means they are not immune to failure themselves. One of the most important challenges in habitat breach scenarios is that everything happens under extreme time pressure because there is no external rescue team that can arrive quickly, no emergency evacuation option to Earth, and no immediate replacement structure available. So survival depends entirely on how quickly internal systems respond and how effectively the crew can react within the first moments of failure. Even small breaches that seem minor at first can escalate quickly if not contained, because the pressure difference between inside and outside Mars environments is so large that any opening becomes a constant loss point until sealed, and if sealing does not occur fast enough, the internal environment can transition from safe to uninhabitable in a very short period of time. The Mars EVA trap, outside means risk. Stepping outside on Mars is not like going outside on Earth. It is not a normal work shift, it is not a field task, and it is not a simple extension of daily activity. It is a controlled survival operation where every second is managed, every movement is calculated, and every action is limited by the fact that the environment itself is trying to kill human life instantly if the suit fails even slightly. And this is why EVA, which means extravehicular activity, is one of the highest risk parts of any Mars mission. Because the moment a person leaves the habitat, they are no longer inside a protected system. They are inside a fully hostile environment where survival depends entirely on the suit they are wearing. A Mars spacesuit is not just clothing. It is a full life support system designed to replace everything the habitat normally provides, including oxygen supply, pressure control, temperature regulation, carbon dioxide removal, and protection from dust and radiation exposure. And all of this must be carried on the body while still allowing movement, which is already a major engineering conflict, because the more protection added, the heavier and stiffer the suit becomes, and the more mobility is reduced. Spacesuit mobility limitations are one of the first things astronauts notice in simulated environments, because even though suits are designed to allow movement, they are pressurized systems, and internal pressure makes the suit naturally resist bending, which means Every movement requires force against that internal pressure. So something as simple as bending a knee, turning a wrist, or gripping a tool becomes physically demanding, and over time, this leads to fatigue even during short EVA tasks. This is why Mars EVA operations are not open-ended activities. They are carefully timed missions with strict limits on duration. Because the suit itself is a closed system with limited oxygen supply, limited carbon dioxide scrubbing capacity, limited battery life, and limited cooling capability. And every minute outside the habitat consumes these resources at a fixed rate that cannot be ignored or extended without risk. One of the most serious hidden risks inside the suit is carbon dioxide buildup, because while oxygen is supplied continuously, the astronaut's body produces carbon dioxide as a waste product, and if the CO2 scrubbing system inside the suit does not remove it efficiently, it begins to accumulate, and even small increases in CO2 levels can cause headaches, confusion, reduced performance, and eventually more serious physiological effects if exposure continues. The danger of CO2 buildup is that it is not always immediately noticeable at early stages, because the astronaut may still feel functional while internal levels are rising. But cognitive performance begins to degrade before full physical symptoms appear, which is extremely dangerous in an environment where precise actions are required for survival, because even small mistakes during EVA can become critical quickly. Another major challenge during EVA operations is dust infiltration into suit systems, because Martian dust is extremely fine and behaves in a way that allows it to enter small gaps, joints, seals, and mechanical interfaces. And once it enters these areas, it does not just sit there. It can interfere with movement, increase friction, and slowly degrade mechanical performance over time. Dust infiltration is especially dangerous in suit joints because spacesuits rely on flexible but sealed joint systems to allow movement. And if dust enters these areas, it can cause stiffness or uneven movement resistance, which makes tasks harder to perform and increases physical strain on the astronaut. And over repeated EVAs, this can reduce efficiency and increase fatigue levels significantly. Dust can also affect life support connections, including oxygen lines, cooling systems, and sensor interfaces. And even small contamination in these systems can create long-term reliability issues because the suit must maintain perfect sealing and flow control at all times. And any reduction in performance increases risk during future EVA operations. When all of these factors combine, spacesuits become environments where even small tasks carry significant risk, because nothing outside the habitat is simple. Every action requires managing oxygen levels, monitoring suit performance, handling mobility limitations, and maintaining awareness of environmental conditions at the same time. And this creates what engineers often describe as a small task becomes life-threatening event pattern. This means that activities that would be simple on Earth, like tightening a bolt, collecting a rock sample, or walking a short distance, become complex operations on Mars because they involve multiple system dependencies, time limits, and environmental risks. And if any part of the suit system begins to degrade during the task, the astronaut must decide whether to continue, stop, or return immediately, all while managing limited resources. Inside EVA operations, there is no margin for delay, because oxygen supply, battery life, and carbon dioxide removal are all running continuously. And once they reach certain limits, the astronaut must return to the habitat regardless of task completion, which means that every EVA is a race against resource depletion rather than an open-ended exploration activity. After returning from EVA, astronauts also have to manage dust contamination on their suits, because dust particles can cling to surfaces and must be carefully removed before re-entering the habitat. Otherwise, they risk introducing contamination into the controlled internal environment. And this decontamination process itself becomes part of the routine workload of Mars surface operations. Now moving from suits to long-term system sustainability, the repair dependency loop becomes one of the most important engineering challenges on Mars. Because unlike Earth, where broken systems can be replaced, repaired, or resupplied through established supply chains, Mars has no external infrastructure support, which means every system that fails must be repaired using onboard tools, spare parts, or local manufacturing capability. Everything must be repaired manually in Mars missions because automated large-scale repair systems are not currently realistic for all failure scenarios. And even when automation exists, human oversight is still required, which means astronauts become not only explorers and operators, but also full-time maintenance engineers responsible for keeping life support systems functioning under extreme conditions. The lack of replacement supply chain is one of the most critical differences between Earth-based systems and Mars systems, because on Earth, if a part fails, it can be replaced quickly. But on Mars, replacement parts must either be carried from Earth at launch or manufactured locally, and both options have major limitations, because carrying everything increases mission weight, while local manufacturing depends on advanced systems that may not cover all possible failure types. This is where 3D printing systems become important in Mars mission planning, because additive manufacturing allows production of certain parts on demand using raw materials. But this capability has limitations, especially in material types, structural strength, precision levels, and complexity of components that can be produced reliably in a Mars environment. Material constraints are one of the biggest limitations of 3D printing on Mars, because not all Earth materials are available locally, and transporting specialized materials from Earth is expensive and limited. So printed parts often rely on a narrow set of base materials that may not match the full range of industrial-grade components needed for complex systems, which means not every broken part can be easily replaced. Precision limitations are another major issue, because many spacecraft and habitat components require extremely high precision manufacturing, especially in seals, valves, and life support interfaces, and even small deviations in dimensions can affect performance or reliability. And while 3D printing technology is improving, achieving consistent high-precision output in a Mars environment remains a major challenge. Over time, this creates a breakdown accumulation effect where small system failures begin to add up across different parts of the habitat, suit systems, and support infrastructure. And because each system depends on others, a small failure in one area can increase stress on other systems, which increases their wear rate, which increases the probability of additional failures, creating a chain reaction of maintenance demand. This breakdown accumulation does not always lead to immediate failure, but it gradually increases operational load on the crew, because more time must be spent on repair, monitoring, and system management instead of exploration or scientific work. And this shifts the entire mission structure toward constant maintenance mode rather than expansion or discovery. Mission timeline of failure, probabilistic death curve. A Mars mission is often shown in a clean, straight story on the outside: launch, travel, landing, exploration, return. But inside real mission planning, there is no straight line like that, because every stage is loaded with different types of risk that do not behave the same way. And when engineers map the full mission from start to finish, what appears is not a line of progress, but a curve of survival probability that shifts shape depending on time, system stress, and resource use. And this is why the concept of a probabilistic death curve is used, because survival is not constant. It changes over time, and it changes based on how many systems are still functioning at full strength. In the earliest phase of the mission, the landing phase, risk is concentrated into a very short but extremely intense window, where everything depends on a sequence of high-speed physical events that must all succeed in order: atmospheric entry, heat shield performance, deceleration, parachute deployment, and powered landing. And each of these steps is sensitive to timing, material strength, and environmental conditions that cannot be controlled once it persists the spacecraft begins entry, which means that even small deviations in performance can lead to complete mission failure within minutes. During this phase, survival probability is not stable. It is highly sensitive to small changes because a single system error can cascade quickly into a full failure event, and there is no time for correction once descent begins, which makes landing one of the highest risk points in the entire mission timeline, even though it is very short in duration compared to the rest of the mission. Once landing is complete, the mission enters what appears to be a more stable phase, but in reality, this is where long-term risk begins to build in a different form, because the habitat becomes the central survival system, and everything now depends on continuous operation of life support, power systems, water systems, food production systems, and communication systems, all operating together in a closed environment that must remain stable without interruption. This is the mid-phase of the mission, where system degradation begins to accumulate slowly, not as a sudden failure, but as small efficiency losses across multiple systems, filters becoming slightly less efficient, mechanical parts experiencing wear, energy systems losing small amounts of output due to dust or degradation, and recycling systems gradually losing small percentages of efficiency. And while each change may seem minor on its own, together they create a growing operational load. Over time, this accumulation of small inefficiencies leads to increased maintenance demand, which increases workload on the crew, which reduces available time for other tasks, and this creates a feedback loop where system degradation increases human workload, and increased workload reduces ability to maintain systems at optimal performance, which then accelerates further degradation. In the late phase of the mission, risk is no longer about single failures or short-term events. It becomes about cumulative system fatigue and resource exhaustion, where spare parts may already be used, consumable materials may be limited, and redundancy systems may no longer be fully available, which means that even small failures can have larger consequences because backup options are reduced or unavailable. At this stage, survival probability declines not in a straight line, but in a shifting curve, because as resources decrease and systems age, the margin for error becomes smaller, and recovery from failure becomes harder. And this is why long-duration Mars missions are not modelled as simple progressions, but as dynamic systems where stability decreases gradually under continuous stress. One of the most important constraints shaping the entire mission is that rescue is not an option, not because it is politically or economically difficult, but because it is physically constrained by orbital mechanics and distance, since Earth and Mars are separated by vast distances that change continuously as both planets orbit the Sun. And this creates specific launch windows approximately every 26 months when travel between the two planets is most efficient. Outside of these windows, launching a rescue mission is either impossible or highly inefficient, which means that if a failure occurs on Mars, there is no immediate way to send help. And even if a rescue mission is prepared as quickly as possible, it still must wait for the next available alignment window, which can take many months. Even after launch, travel time between Earth and Mars is typically measured in months, often 6 to 9 months depending on trajectory, which means that even under ideal conditions, rescue is not fast enough to respond to critical emergencies on Mars, because survival windows for many failure scenarios are measured in hours, days, or weeks at most, not months. There is also no fast evacuation system that can bring humans back from Mars quickly, because spacecraft must follow energy-efficient trajectories to conserve fuel and ensure safe travel. And there is currently no propulsion technology capable of enabling rapid return within short time frames, which means that evacuation is not a real-time safety option, but a long-duration process that cannot prevent immediate failure outcomes. Because of these constraints, Mars missions must be designed as fully self-contained survival systems, where every critical function must operate independently without relying on Earth intervention during emergencies, and this fundamentally changes how safety, redundancy, and system design are approached. The first mission scenario simulations reflect this reality, and they begin by modelling crew composition not just as job roles, but as survival units, where engineers, pilots, and scientists are selected not only for technical skill, but for their ability to operate under continuous stress, isolation, and multi-role responsibility. Because on Mars, every crew member must be capable of handling multiple systems when needed. In simulation environments, the first 30 days often appear stable, with systems functioning as expected, communication with Earth still reliable, and crew routines following planned schedules, which creates what appears to be a controlled success environment. But this phase is also deceptive, because system stress is already beginning to build in small ways that are not immediately visible. From day 31 onward, system stress accumulation begins to become more noticeable, not through sudden failures, but through small inefficiencies that begin to appear across different systems, increased maintenance requirements, minor performance drops, and slightly higher energy consumption. And while none of these changes are immediately critical, they mark the beginning of long-term system degradation. This pattern has been observed in Earth analog missions, such as High Seas in Hawaii and the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, where crews live in isolated Mars-like environments for extended periods. And in these simulations, researchers consistently observe that even in controlled environments, long-term isolation leads to gradual system strain, both in technical systems and human behaviour. Antarctic isolation studies also provide important data, because crews living in Antarctic stations experience long periods of isolation under extreme environmental conditions. And over time, studies show that even well-trained teams experience gradual changes in performance, mood stability, and group coordination as isolation duration increases. Submarine confinement studies provide another layer of insight, because submarines operate in sealed environments with limited space and continuous operational demands. And over long deployments, crews experience increased sensitivity to system issues, reduced tolerance for small problems, and heightened stress responses to operational pressure. Across all these analog environments, a consistent pattern emerges, which is that system degradation always wins over time, if not actively managed, meaning that even highly controlled systems eventually experience performance decline under long-duration stress, unless constant maintenance and resource input is sustained. The real engineering bottleneck in Mars missions is not rocket technology, not landing capability, and not propulsion efficiency, because these are short-duration challenges that end once the spacecraft lands. The real bottleneck is closed-loop life support sustainability over years, because this system must operate continuously without interruption in an environment that provides no natural support. Closed-loop systems must recycle air, water, and waste, maintain temperature, support food production, and ensure chemical balance, all within a sealed environment where nothing is naturally replenished and every loss must be recovered internally, which creates a system that depends entirely on efficiency and balance across multiple interlinked subsystems. Over time, even small inefficiencies in closed-loop systems accumulate, creating feedback loops where one system failure increases load on another system, which increases wear, which increases probability of further failure. And this cascading effect is one of the main long-term risks in Mars habitat design. When all known risks are analysed together, engineers identify a set of most likely ways the first humans could die on Mars. And these are not speculative scenarios, but structured risk categories based on system dependencies and known physical limitations. The first and most critical risk is habitat depressurization, where loss of pressure integrity leads to rapid transition from survivable environment to lethal vacuum exposure. And because pressure is essential for human survival, even small breaches can escalate quickly if not contained. The second major risk is radiation-induced illness, because Mars lacks a protective magnetic field and thick atmosphere, which means long-term exposure to cosmic radiation and solar particle events can increase health risks over time, including cellular damage and long-term biological stress. The third major risk is system-wide power failure, where loss of energy supply affects multiple life support systems simultaneously, including oxygen production, temperature control, water processing, and communication systems, creating cascading system instability. The fourth major risk is medical emergency without treatment, where conditions that are easily treatable on Earth become critical on Mars due to lack of full medical infrastructure, delayed Earth communication, and limited onboard surgical capability. The fifth major risk is resource exhaustion cascade, where gradual depletion of spare parts, consumables, and system redundancy increases vulnerability over time, making recovery from failures more difficult as mission duration increases. When all of these factors are combined into a full mission timeline, the final sequence is not a single dramatic failure, but a gradual shift where system stability slowly decreases under continuous stress, while external rescue options remain physically impossible due to orbital timing, travel duration, and distance constraints. This leads to the final reality of Mars missions, where Mars does not need to be hostile in intent because it is not acting at all. It is simply a physical system governed by environmental laws, and within that system, humans can only survive for as long as engineered life support systems remain functional within safe limits. And this is why the central truth of Mars exploration is not exploration in the traditional sense, but continuous system maintenance under extreme constraints, where survival depends not on reaching the planet, but on the uninterrupted ability to keep complex, interdependent systems functioning in an environment that offers no natural support and no immediate escape once those systems begin to fail.